Thank you all for your diligent attendance at today's marathon of events. I know it's been a very long day, but we have one final excellent panel ahead of you all. For those just joining us, my name is Will Barbie, and I am a junior in Silliman College and the Speakers Director of the Buckley program at Yale. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to our conversation between Nadine Strossen and Marianne Franks, entitled, "What Are the Limits of Free Speech?" One of the aspects that makes free speech such a unique subject is that it's one of the few principles that allows itself to undermine itself. This leads to a dilemma. What happens when someone wants to use free speech to denounce free speech? While the issue certainly merits much discussion, I believe there are no two people better inclined to answer this question than our guests this evening. As a prefatory note, I want to clarify the structure and style of this debate. Rather than being moderated in a traditional format with timed opening remarks and planned space for rebuttals, we will allow for a natural, free-flowing conversation between the two speakers to allow them to engage with topics in a way that facilitates the discovery of common ground and the fleshing out of disagreement. I trust that, with this format, we will all walk away with a nuanced perspective on the topic, something that, in the spirit of free speech, we all ought to strive for. Now for our guests. Nadine Strossen is the New York Law School Professor Emerita and Senior Fellow at FIRE, and was the National President of the ACLU from 1991 to 2008. An internationally acclaimed free speech scholar and advocate who regularly addresses diverse audiences and provides media commentary around the world, Strossen is also the host and project consultant for Free to Speak, a 3-hour documentary film series distributed on public television in 2023. Her books about free speech include Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know, Hate, H-A-T-E, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, and Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights, which was republished with a new preface in 2024 as part of the NYU Classics series. In 2023, Strossen received the National Coalition Against Censorship's Judy Blume Lifetime Achievement Award for free speech. Marianne Franks is the Eugene L. and Barbara A. Bernard Professor in Intellectual Property, Technology, and Civil Rights Law at George Washington Law School and the President and Legislative and Tech Policy Director of the nonprofit organization Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. Her areas of expertise include First and Second Amendment law, criminal law, family law, and the intersection of civil rights and technology. She is the author of the award-winning book, The Cult of the Constitution, Our Deadly Devotion to Guns and Free Speech. And her new book, Fearless Speech, has just been published by Bold Type Books. She holds a JD from Harvard Law School, as well as a doctorate from Oxford University, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar. She's a member of the District of Columbia Bar and an affiliate fellow of the Yale Law School Information Society Project. Please join me in welcoming both of them to the Buckley Institute.
I just want to thank Will for that gracious introduction, the audience for the warm welcome. Most of all, I want to thank Marianne because I think this is a pretty free speech-oriented audience, and I think that she's a little bit going into the lion's den. We've talked a lot about courage, and I respect that courage. I do it myself, Marianne, so I empathize. And we agreed that we would like to promote the spirit of critical inquiry to which the Buckley Institute, as well as the Woodward Report that we're all talking about, were dedicated, and we thought we could best do that by having a conversation in which we're not just trying to score debaters' points, we could do that very well, but in which we are trying to deepen each other's and hopefully the audience's pursuit of truth with respect to this very important question.
And with that, I will turn it over to both of you and ask, what are the limits of free speech?
Thanks so much, Will. And thank you, Nadine, because this is something I definitely do want to take a moment to acknowledge, is the graciousness that Nadine has always shown me throughout the years and the many conversations that we have had, knowing that we have some serious differences, but always learning something from Nadine every time I have the opportunity to be in conversation with her. I would say that I would push back a little bit already on the characterization of feeling as though if I am in a conversation or among people who care about free speech that I would feel a bit out of sorts. Part of what I'm trying to push back on, generally speaking, with my book and with the work that I do, is asking the question of what we mean by free speech. Who gets to own it? Who gets to claim that they're defending it, as opposed to a person who says that they are, and no one really ever says, that they are the ones opposing it.
Fair point.
But I do want to back up and think about the title of this discussion, The Limits of Free Speech, because I think it was probably meant in a kind of way of, well, what do you think are the boundaries, as in what should not be covered by free speech? And I'm going to take a slightly different angle to talk about what I think of as the failures or the limitations of free speech. So that's where I want to kind of reorient this conversation. And I'll start by saying what I mean by that, and the failures of free speech that I'm most interested in, really want to reference what happened a few days ago, Tuesday night. I want to talk about the fact that a person who has self-identified as a dictator, someone whose chief of staff referred to him as a fascist, someone whose own vice presidential candidate called him America's Hitler, a person who has said he wants to lock up his enemies, that he thinks that people who criticize Supreme Court justices should be jailed, a person who thinks that flag burning should be punishable by jail time or deportation, loss of citizenship. That is the person who is now holding, once again, the most powerful office in the United States. And this is happening at a time where we have already seen for many years members of Congress exerting their influence and their power to tell universities what they must believe and must say upon pain of losing their jobs or losing their funding, in the midst of a very long, concerted, far-right campaign to assault higher education and K-12 education. We are in an era of government oppression, book bans, curricular censorship, attacks on professors, attacks on students, the demonization of students, the vilification of protest. All of this is happening right now. All of this is happening right now. I would say that any free speech theory, any free speech practice that is worthy of the name, that does not keep us from voting for fascism, voting for government censorship and oppression, is a failure. So I think we've failed. Whatever version of free speech we have right now, that is the status quo, is a failure. Now, where do we go from that? What does that mean in terms of how we can speak past these failures or what has happened in the last couple of days? I find it interesting that in the midst of this moment that we are in, 3 days out from an election, a conference that is supposedly devoted to the questions of free speech don't mention anything about the actual people in power who have been censoring and oppressing free speech for years now, and are not saying anything about the fact that the new president says he's going to attack education even more than he did before. He's going to vilify more professors. He's going to censor more things that he doesn't like. But that has not been the villain throughout this entire conversation. That's not the threat throughout this entire day. It's been DEI administrators. It's been heckling students. It's been somehow, I guess, fragile rape victims. They're the ones who are somehow the threat to free speech. I find that very odd. And so part of what I am trying to say in my book and in my work is, whatever we think we have done with our dedication to free speech, if we are not paying attention to the actual sources of real power, government oppression, the thing that the First Amendment actually does say and does protect us from, supposedly, government interference with our right to say and do things, if that is not what is top of mind, top of our priorities, and instead we're going to be pointing fingers at students, at administrators, at professors, who compared to the power of the government have so little to say and to do, then I think that whatever we have done with free speech has been a failure.
Well, I have to say that I reject the binary, Marianne. I agree with all of the complaints that you've made about government censorship, although I would not see the voluntary choice in a free and fair and democratic election of a candidate who has enormous popular support, enormous support across every demographic group. This is not an endorsement of Trump. It's an endorsement of the democratic process and of the debate and deliberation very vigorously that went into the election. I would not judge whether freedom of speech is a success or a failure by which ideas predominate. That is to say, if we disagree with the policies of whoever is elected to office, we raise our own First Amendment. We exercise our own First Amendment rights, not only through the kind of criticism that you have just eloquently engaged in, but also through organizing, through advocating, through petitioning. This is how the United States has avoided lapsing into fascism. This is how the United States, over the course of history, has advanced closer and closer to the founding ideals of liberty and justice for all, which, of course, we were very far away from at the beginning. But how have we made progress? We have made progress through people who even did not have the right to vote, raising their voices, organizing, advocating, petitioning, using the constitutional amendment processes to bring about more justice for more people. Since you raised the new president, I want to show you my favorite prop. Don't get a heart attack, Marianne. Can you read what it actually says? No.
It says make J.S. Mill great again.
It says make J.S. Mill great again. Okay. And in that spirit, this refers to another point that you made, Marianne. I think we do not have to choose between concerns about government censorship, which are very weighty, and private sector pressures that result in speech suppression, usually called cancel culture. And I refer to John Stuart Mill. His classic work on liberty back in 1859 focused expressly not on government censorship. He said that's an easier problem to deal with, but with social pressure and with peer pressure. So a lot of in fact, all of the government censorship problems that you refer to are rectifiable. The ACLU, FIRE, other organizations bring lawsuits and have largely succeeded in challenging restrictions on protests, book bans, and so forth. But there is no First Amendment solution to the problem of cancel culture, which is what explains the repressive atmosphere that we've been talking about here at Yale and pervasive throughout universities. Students and faculty members are not talking about the most important issues, including abortion and gun control, a whole host of other issues according to FIRE and other data, not because they fear that the President of the United States or even the President of the university is going to suppress them, but because of their fear of what their peers will do.
And all of that you just said just now makes it sound like everything you just described, that what they're fearing is the judgment of their peers. What's so ironic to me about this is the same group that says, you know what, fragile students are the problem. The emotional status of students is the problem. They need to be okay with criticism. They need to be okay with being uncomfortable. Well, what happened to that sense of grow a spine when you're talking about the fact that you're scared to express your conservative viewpoints because people won't like you? People get to not like you. They get to. And the idea that we're suddenly going to pay attention to feelings because now it's conservatives who are hurt, I don't buy it, right? I don't buy FIRE's rankings because they're based on feelings, and I don't care that much about people's feelings. I care more about the fact that there are real reasons to be afraid of what the consequences of speech are. So when people talk about threats, when people talk about harassment, when they talk about death threats, when they talk about having to leave their home, yeah, those things matter, and they have been going on all this time. They've just been happening to black people and to women and to gay people, and no one cared. But the moment it became about how conservatives were saying, well, women won't date me because they know about my racial views, well, you know what? Who cares? Who cares? So, but before I get to even that obsession with feelings, once it's the right people whose feelings we care about, the idea that there's not a connection, right? Or that you say that these two things really, First Amendment, cancel culture, they go together. They go together, in my view, very much in a very different way. That the conversation around free speech and the way that there's been this relentless propaganda campaign to create a manufactured free speech crisis on campuses, to convince the American public that there is no free speech on these campuses, has been exactly the means by which we've gotten government censorship. Because if you keep vilifying the professors and the students and the administrators, who gets to step in? Members of Congress get to say, hey, you need to obey our orthodoxy, otherwise we're going to take away your funding. Or billionaire donors get to say, hey, we get to dictate what kinds of things you get to say, otherwise we're going to take away your funding. Or you get to say, oh, there's all these problems with cancel culture and people heckling, so the Goldwater Institute gets to decide what bills are going to get passed. So what you're going to do in those situations, you're going to say, we're going to take the decisions away from the community and give them to the government. So it's not even just that I'm suggesting that the free speech discourse, the really common one, it's not just common here, it's common everywhere, is always the same. Oh, there's a crisis. People can't handle feelings, or their feelings are too big for these controversial topics, so we have to do something else. And that something else always turns out to be, you've got to invite the government to actually punish the censors with censorship. And so what happened in the last year when everybody got scrambled, right? All of a sudden the people who said, all protests, we love disruption, said, oh, but not like that. Not for that particular cause. Not when you made those people uncomfortable. You scratch the surface of any self-professed free speech absolutist, and it's always, well, I didn't mean that, though. And I'm not saying that as a gotcha. That is just because free speech issues are hard. They're just hard sometimes. They actually are. And anybody who tries to pretend that they're not and says, oh, I'm truly neutral, I just want to hear all the sides. No, you don't. You don't. And it's not the same thing about whether or not you can say something in the classroom without feeling uncomfortable, which again, why is that a priority for any pedagogical environment, right? Because the first questions we should be asking is, were you contributing an idea that was informed, first of all? Because if you're starting to talk about your political views in a math class, what are you doing, right? So we have to ask all of these questions about the purpose of the classroom, the purpose of the moment that you were speaking, or the extra, curricular speaker that you've decided to invite in. I'll say a lot of the times when students protest these things, they're not saying, oh, I'm so offended by the idea, I can't stand it. They're saying, why are you wasting my hard-earned student tuition money on this person who's not even particularly intelligent or has nothing interesting to say? That's a legitimate question, because when we talk about economies of free speech is not actually free, right? If you invite a speaker that's going to cost $30,000 in security, then that's your student budget for speakers for the whole year, right? If you invite a speaker who's actually going to disrupt the entire classroom process for 3 days, you have really imposed a cost on that community. I'm not saying there's an easy answer here, but I'm saying it's not so easy as to say, oh, the people who objected that are just so offended. No. They might be saying, why can't you make a better case for why in a university environment in particular, you should be saying why you are of quality enough to be here? Because why would we just say, oh, we're going to invite anybody at all who has a controversial idea? You don't really want to invite somebody in who says, well, actually, I think child pornography is the best thing ever, and let me give you 35 minutes of why that's the case. I haven't really seen that many universities inviting people like that, because that's not an idea that is really worth sharing within an institutional community. The point of institutional communities is supposed to be, as Justice Frankfurter said back in 1952, to sift through evanescent doctrine, to find ideas that are actually quality ideas. Now, you might be worried about that, to say, well, who gets to decide? Well, that is part of what a community that is engaged in a community together does get to decide for itself. And they do get to make assessments. They should be making assessments about whether this idea is even worth expressing, because not all of them are. For any number of reasons. They might just be irrelevant. They might just be stupid. You might just not have done the reading. There's all kinds of reasons, right? Most of those issues that are really tough for communities, for classrooms, are genuinely ones that can't be summarized in really reassuring platitudes about how, oh, we just have to take both sides. They're actually much harder than that. And anybody who's spent a lot of time in a classroom knows that it's harder than that. So I'm very concerned about not just the fact that we're not caring enough about the kinds of governmental forces that are actually censoring ideas out of classrooms, but that's a huge part of it. I'm concerned about the fact that the propaganda that got us there to justify that is also free speech. that when Ron DeSantis says, I'm going to ban these words, he says, I'm trying to respect the First Amendment. Ron DeSantis was praised by fire when he endorsed the Chicago Principles, because everybody loves the Chicago Principles, except for Chicago when it arrests its peacefully protesting anti-war students, or except for Chicago when a woman a faculty member tries to have a class called The Problem with Whiteness, and a student who's never taken the class is so offended by just the title, he organizes an online hatred threatening campaign against her so that she has to move the class and teach it behind a locked door. They don't do anything for her. So my point is, every time there's a reassurance about how, well, we need to be anti-cancel culture, we need to be more expansive, we need to protect free speech, scratch the surface and find out that what that really means is speech that those who are in power like, and not the speech that those who have actually been struggling to be included in those conversations really want to ever say. I know I've got one fan, just one, and that's okay, because it's Kenneth Barber, right? And Kenneth Barber is one of the reasons why I'm here, because I read your dissent. I read your dissent, and I thought, this is interesting. This is someone who was actually, at this time, you were a student at the time, is that right? Is actually saying, you know, in contrast to all of these abstract platitudes that are being said, let's talk about the material reality of what's on the ground. I know this wasn't even something you mentioned in particular, but it prompted me to look it up. 1974, how long had actually women even been admitted at Yale? 1969, it turns out. How long had non-white men been admitted? 1964, I think it was. So we're talking about, we could have taken any number of perspectives on what is the problem with freedom of expression and pluralism, et cetera, but the one that was taken was, I'm not sure if enough controversial speakers have enough adoration given to them. That was the question. That, to me, seems very dysfunctional.
And who invited you, by the way, Ken?
Nadine.
Yes, yes, yes.
She's good at knowing who to invite, is what I would say.
I mean,
Not inviting Nadine.
yeah.
Oh,
yes,
well, that's interesting.
I did. Marianne, you have made a lot of generalizations, and there are a lot of distortions in what you've said, a lot of caricatures about what free speech is and is not. I consider myself to be a neutral, even-handed defender of freedom for all ideas, for all perspectives, for all people. That's why I felt it was very important to invite Ken here. Much more importantly, that is the mission of organizations like FIRE and the ACLU, and even more important than that, that is what the United States Supreme Court, with no dissent in modern history, has saluted as the bedrock principle of free speech: viewpoint neutrality. No matter what the view, what the idea, what the opinion, what the content or message of speech, the fact that it is disliked or unpopular is never a justification for government to censor it. And the reason why the court has consistently enforced that principle, the reason why groups like the ACLU and FIRE continue to support that principle, no matter whose speech is involved in a particular case, whether it's somebody who is labeled a fascist or whether it's somebody who is labeled a socialist. And we can debate whether either of those labels is fair, but they are equally entitled to freedom of speech from government censorship. Now, you raise a very important point about cancel culture, which is why that is, to me, a difficult issue. Defending freedom for ideas I hate, I actually find quite easy. And many of you know that I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. Many people ask me, how can you, as a Jew and the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, how can you defend the ACLU's defense of free speech for the neo-Nazis in Skokie, or for Unite the Right demonstrators in Charlottesville in 2017? And the answer to me is very easy, because we are not defending freedom for the particular idea. We are defending the principle of viewpoint neutrality, which throughout American history and to this day is especially important for disempowered minority groups. By definition, those groups are never going to have access to the majoritarian levers of power. We therefore depend on the freedom to raise our voices, to protest the exclusion and the injustice and the oppression. Martin Luther King and so many other demonstrators and leaders for civil rights, human rights, women's rights, gay rights, every minority cause has championed freedom of speech as most essential for them. There are so many quotes, but one that I heard very recently, Martin Luther King, who said, "The greatness of America is the right to protest for rights." Now, on the issue of cancel culture, Marianne, I agree, is a very difficult issue insofar as it definitely consists of exercising free speech rights. I would absolutely oppose any government or other official effort by a university, for example, to suppress even the most unfair criticism, even advocacy of punishing, even advocacy of shaming, shunning, ostracizing. But we're talking about a cultural issue, and that means that the response has to also be on the level of culture. We have to try to nurture a culture that strikes an accommodation between, on the one hand, welcoming and encouraging, robust, even harsh, even unfair, hurtful criticism, but not creating a culture where the punishment, the retaliation, is so disproportionately harsh that it results in not only silencing the particular person who's targeted, but creating that's why we use the term cancel culture, resulting in large percentages of people, even in universities, being afraid not only to air certain ideas for fear that they might be seen as offensive or worse, but not even wanting to address whole topics. That is a pernicious culture. We have to acknowledge that it exists, and we have to raise our voices to counter it.
So, viewpoint discrimination. A couple of things about this. It actually isn't true that the First Amendment says you can never discriminate on the basis of viewpoint, because what are the longstanding categories that the Supreme Court always tells us about? They say, well, child porn's not covered. We don't mean fraud. We don't mean incitement. We don't mean perjury, right? We don't mean food and drug labeling. We don't mean price fixing. There are a lot of things that we decide on the basis of viewpoint or content actually cannot be covered by the First. Obscenity, right? Obscenity is an exception to the First Amendment that the Supreme Court keeps validating, and it's literally based on feelings, right? If you are offended by something, then obscenity doesn't cover it. That is, if it's classified as obscenity, then the First Amendment won't cover it. So we can't keep telling ourselves these lies that the First Amendment says you can never discriminate on the basis of viewpoint, except when you can. And I would just say that if we're going to have a First Amendment that is workable, let's be honest about the fact that, yes, there are exceptions. We have to sort out what those exceptions are and make them intelligible. And that's just the First Amendment, though, right? There's a very deep and meaningful reason for why the First Amendment, generally speaking, and this actually we do agree on. It's in my book. I say the most probably profound principle that I would agree upon, that is kind of a First Amendment orthodoxy principle, is that the government should never be allowed to punish you simply because it doesn't like what you're saying. You and I agree on this. That's the government, because the government has powers that no one else has. It is for good reason that we also have this thing called the state action doctrine. It is for good reason that we also have the principle of no compelled speech. That is to say, you can't tell anybody other than the government that they can't discriminate on the basis of viewpoint, because, of course, that's all of our jobs. When the newspaper doesn't run my letter to the op-ed, right, they're not discriminating against me. They're not censoring me, I should say. They're not censoring me. They are choosing not to publish something because that's their right to do so. If they do choose to have my op-ed and they choose to have a really critical response to it, that is also not censoring me. All of those things are just the way that the world works when you're not the government. When I say that the worst model we could use in universities, private universities, social media, et cetera, is the First Amendment, it's because the First Amendment only works if we're talking about government versus other forms of power. Otherwise, what you're really talking about is compelling private people to not do or to do things or to say things that they don't want to, and that can't be right either. So what I'm suggesting with the cancel culture problem is, usually what that really means is someone is unhappy that they were criticized. And that, I'm sorry, that is speech. And so if we're going to criticize that, then you are criticizing the very nature of speech. And when we talk about, well, yes, is free speech an important concept? Yes, of course it is. That's why when we have these lovely quotes by Martin Luther King and others, that's wonderful. What happened to Martin Luther King? Is the First Amendment enough to stop a bullet? And if it's not, then let's at least be honest about how that's not enough for the most radical members of our society, for the most disliked ideas, which, by the way, are not racism and sexism. Racism, sexism win every damn day. It is not some sort of oppressed, out there kind of outsider status. That is the country we have. So what we have seen throughout history is not the First Amendment showing up for people who were saying, let's abolish slavery. The First Amendment didn't show up for them. First Amendment wasn't even interpreted in a way that it could be allowed to defend them until like 1900 something, right? So it doesn't show up for them. When you talked about the suffragists, yes, they were out there picketing in front of the White House and they got arrested for blocking traffic and they were tortured in prisons. The First Amendment didn't show up for them. The ACLU, yes. Do they do a lot of good work? Yes, of course. Does the fire sometimes do good work? Occasionally. But the point isn't whether or not in one case or another that you can actually be on the right side. It's about whether or not, as a general matter, you are making it harder for the government to oppress people who are actually doing something radical and revolutionary. And on balance, I would say no. Because most of what is being generated now is propaganda about this kind of cancel culture that, again, invites in government crackdowns. That is what the entire assault on education is about. So I would say, yes, let's talk about how we can have an aspirational First Amendment, a better one. I like that idea very much. But let's distinguish between what our aspirations are and what has actually happened. And also, I would really want to push back on any absolutist ideas about what the ACLU or anyone else has done in terms of always protecting viewpoint. Point you just in passing, right, to look up when the ACLU fired one of its own employees because they didn't like the speech that she was saying at work. And then they were forced to reinstate her because they also violated labor practices, right? Everyone has a thing, right? There's always going to be some moment where you say, we're not going to defend you, we're not going to take this up. And we all have choices to make about where we're going to put those resources and who we're going to get behind. When the ACLU decides to defend the NRA, that may seem really principled, but why is that a good use of the NRA's, of the ACLU's resources when the NRA's got plenty of its own? Why not actually take up a case like, I don't know, Amber Heard writing an op-ed, words that people didn't like, that her ex-husband really didn't like, words about domestic violence. Let her get sued for millions of dollars for an op-ed that the ACLU actually asked her to write. And then who stuck around to defend her afterwards? Not them. So I would just say we can congratulate ourselves all we want about how the First Amendment's always done this thing. We might want to believe that that's true, but it just isn't true. I believe this as an aspiration. I believe it as in this is what we should be working towards. But all of the really difficult, interesting free speech questions cannot be resolved with cliches about how, well, we'll just do both sides, or we'll just do counter speech, or some things can't be answered. Misinformation, I know maybe that's the boogeyman now, but like it can't be answered. You know what happened in some ways with this election? College-educated people went which way? They voted for Harris. People without college degrees voted for Trump. People who were wrong, literally wrong, about inflation, about crime, about the stock market, about illegal border crossings, people who were wrong, not opinions, but literally wrong, voted for Trump. That tells you something, right? That tells you something. It tells you something about the information economy we have, and the fact that, again, if you believe in free speech, if you believe that it's going to get us to the truth and to autonomy and democracy, there is no better object lesson than what has just happened this week to tell us that is not the case.
Oh, wow. There's a whole lot there that I disagree with. I'm not going to obviously have time to respond to all of it. Can I at least make one point? At least one point? I'll just say in passing that the U.S. Supreme Court has consistently held in modern history without dissent that the viewpoint neutrality principle does apply in the consistently. Government may never punish speech solely because of disagreement with its viewpoint. It's true, obscenity is the one exception to that, but every other kind of speech that you mentioned, Marianne, It satisfies what the Supreme Court has called the emergency principle, that you're not looking only at the viewpoint of the speech, you are looking at it in overall context. And if in the facts and circumstances, the speech either directly causes or imminently threatens certain harm, then it can be punished. It's not being punished solely because of the viewpoint. Child pornography, the first example that you mentioned, is punished because that consists of exploitation of an actual child. It is not because of the message, it's because of the exploitation of the child. Fraud, somebody is relying on an intentional lie to their detriment. It's not solely because of viewpoint, and so forth. And since fraud is one of the appropriately narrow categories of false speech that the Supreme Court has allowed to be suppressed, I want to just jump in here and say the idea of trying to impose some limits on what you see as disinformation and misinformation is really chilling.
I haven't suggested anything.
Okay.
I haven't. I said
but you were suggesting
people who
that
are
free
wrong
speech
about facts
is
voted
so
a certain way.
dangerous.
That's all I said.
Is so dangerous.
I didn't propose anything.
Okay. Well, let me just say there are a lot of calls, and one of the prior panelists said something I agree with, that we're going to see more and more pressure from those who have access to power to restrict so-called disinformation. When the United States Supreme Court, with very lopsided vote, recently reaffirmed the proposition that most false and misleading speech is constitutionally protected, the court said, we do not need George Orwell's Ministry of Truth in this country. That is... So that's inconsistent not only with individual liberty, but also with equality of all of us to debate what we consider to be true, and with democracy. And the answer to speech that you consider to be dangerous, Marianne, I applaud your eloquent and impassioned exercise of your free speech to counter it. And I don't think we need to enlist any further restrictions. The First Amendment has done you great service in raising your interesting and thought-provoking ideas.
One last thing on this, because this is exactly the move that I take issue with in my book. When I say, we look throughout history and we say, oh, here are some good examples of brave speech, of free speech, what have you. And my emphasis is not to say, oh, we don't care about the First Amendment. My point is to say, throughout history, and my book is really about people who have spoken out when they didn't have any protections. There's an entire chapter where I do profiles in fearless speech, where people knew that they were going to be risking their lives, their reputations, everything, they did it anyway. I write about Dorothy Thompson, who in 1939, at the first Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden, heckled the Nazis. She heckled them. She says, you are all Nazis, this is all bunk, this is Mein Kampf, and she's muscled out. The First Amendment doesn't stand up for her, and she criticized it the next day. This reporter, this journalist, a very famous journalist, Dorothy Thompson, says, the idea that the free speech doctrine is going to protect the Nazis and not me, that is not the way that we are going to keep a democratic country. What my regret is, when I look at those examples, I say, I don't attribute it to the First Amendment. The law didn't give me that. The law didn't give it to Dorothy Thompson. People took it. The people, Elijah Lovejoy standing in front of a mob saying, I will publish whatever I want about slavery, right before he's shot to death by that mob, that's who I am interested in. I'm not interested in telling us a story about how great the First Amendment is. I am interested in telling the story of how great fearless speakers are. So that is the point of my book, and that is what I want to emphasize.
I completely
Sorry,
agree with
would you
that
mind if
because
I just interrupt
can I
just
just
for a
say
moment?
one little point, which is
One final point, and then we have to move into questions.
No constitutional right is self-executing, and that was true of the First Amendment as the Equal Protection Clause and all of the other great freedom charters in language. James Madison, the chief author himself, said that this is a mere parchment barrier between the people and government abuse, and it does require brave individuals to stand up and exercise their rights, and dedicated lawyers and organizations to help them assert their rights, and Supreme Court justices and other judges to uphold their challenges. So I would say all of the above. The people alone could not have free speech if there were not the legal guarantee and the courts of law and the organizations and lawyers and advocates to actually defend those rights. But those structures could not do anything unless there were noble and brave and courageous individuals throughout history to actually stand up for their rights.
Thank you both very much for a very impassioned conversation. We have another 15 or so minutes for some questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We will do our best to get to you.
Thank you. Hello. Should I stand up? Hello, I'm Manish. My question is on, first of all, has to start with an observation. I think it's very interesting how, I guess, currently the progressive side of the political spectrum is more willing or has a greater proclivity to actually stand up for the good or their conception of the good, and using free expression as a means to an end, and conservatives are walking on eggshells or obfuscating what they actually believe in under this facade of value neutrality or free expression without recognizing that the end is what they conceive as the truth and free expression should be the means. So why is it that conservatives now are sort of hiding or under the guise of free expression, and we have ceded the ground to progressives to conceive what it means to actually have an end, or what the end of free expression is? Why is it that the progressive wing of the political spectrum is more willing to engage in this, and the conservative wing feels the need to sort of still work with sort of the Overton window, within the Overton window, to sort of push it in any direction that it so chooses?
I would just respectfully say, in my long experience, most people, whether conservative, liberal, progressive, anywhere else, most people do tend to defend freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. There is a lot of result orientation, and I agree with Marianne that there are relatively few people who will consistently defend freedom, even for ideas that are antithetical to their own beliefs.
I would just add to that, I guess, one thing, which is a little bit picking up on your explanation of why, well, the First Amendment, we'll have to put aside the obscenity exception, which I don't think you can. I don't think if you're going to pick and choose, then what you're admitting is there's things to be criticized, and I'm just suggesting there might be more than what's obvious. But about the child pornography example, yes, let's talk about how if the law is saying, well, that's because there's harm as opposed to mere offense, I'm all for that. I am all for the Supreme Court, for all of our institutions to say, be honest, concede the fact that when you think that something is harmful, you think the First Amendment runs out. Now let's have an honest discussion about what is actually harmful and what is not, what is merely offensive. I want that discussion. What I don't want is a Supreme Court that keeps saying, oh yeah, we don't ever do that. We never do harm balancing. It's all been taken care of. That's ridiculous. Talk about the fact that you have made value judgments about what is considered so harmful that it doesn't get First Amendment protection, and then let's have a reasonable discussion about what belongs in that category and what does not.
Hello, and thank you both for your passionate expressions of your own free speech. My name's David. I'm a first year in the college, and I want to sort of circle back to this idea that institutions, specifically institutions of higher learning, somehow should not have free speech as their be-all, end-all principle and the thing that they focus on maximally. I question then, if we do not have free speech as this guiding principle, what do we replace it with? And if it is something labeled as the pursuit of truth, how do we define that truth? And ultimately, do I need to have a college education for my opinion to be valid?
David, I think that part of the point that you're raising goes to something that Marianne said that I didn't have a chance to comment on, and that is that the concept of free speech and academic freedom is very specifically defined in a university setting when the purpose of the expression is for research, scholarship, or teaching. There are appropriate professional restraints. Alex Morey alluded to this in an earlier panel. So, Marianne, I'm not aware of any reasonable defender of the First Amendment who would say, to use your example, that in a math class you can stand up and start spewing off about a political issue. That it would be an abuse of the professorial responsibility to teach math, which is what the purpose of that class is. Likewise, a student, I don't care what perspective the student has on a political issue, it is inappropriate to discuss that in a math class. So to the extent that the purpose of the university is an educational mission, there are appropriate limits on expression. There are appropriate content-based limits, right? Faculty members have not only a right but a responsibility to judge the content of students' writing, the content of their peers' writing, according to professional standards, the standards of their discipline, not according to political or partisan considerations. That said, I agree with Alex, and this is something that came out of the free speech movement that's now celebrating its 60th anniversary. I do think that the public areas of campus should be areas where students are encouraged, and faculty members and other members of the community, to engage in the most freewheeling debate and discussion of public issues that would be permitted in a public park.
Yeah, and I would say what's so interesting about just this exchange is that by the time you start having that question asked by members of the community, what is our guiding principle? And that's come up a couple of times today. Usually the answer is not, at least in the mission statements of colleges, free speech. We might think it is, and this is what I find so interesting. People might assume that it is, but it usually isn't. So maybe a huge part of the debate that we're having is actually about the wrong terms, right? What is a college supposed to be about? And is there a universal answer to that, or is there something about each individual institution that they need to decide for themselves? My sense is it's much closer to ask the community to decide this and think about how you can renegotiate that if there are people that think that it should be different, but that it shouldn't be coming from Congress, and it shouldn't be coming from DeSantis, and it shouldn't be coming from billionaire donors, it shouldn't be coming from media representations. Those are the things that shouldn't be part of this conversation. Communities that are actually invested in that community should be making those kinds of choices, and they're hard choices. And as to the question about whether or not you need a college education, no, of course not. Part of what is so disturbing about the overemphasis on institutions of higher learning, especially elite ones, is this kind of narcissism about how, well, I guess we'll figure out whether or not we have free speech by looking at elite universities. Why would we do that? It's such a tiny fraction of the world, such a tiny fraction of society. My point about college education was that the reason why it's coming under attack is because people who don't like freedom, people who don't like democracy, are coming for education because they know that an uninformed population is one they can control. That's a problem. So what should we do about that? Have more opportunities for education for everyone, accessible ones, because everybody is entitled to have an education. Everyone is entitled to be informed.
Hello, my name is Diego. I'm a sophomore in Yale College. And so earlier during the debate, it was mentioned that it was primarily college uneducated people voting for Trump, which I find primarily to be false, as I'm sure there are many college educated people here and Yaleys who did vote for Trump. But with that being said, it brings up to the point of, do you actually need a college education for an opinion to be valid? And if so, does this not show that college education is actually of more of an indoctrination than an education? Because if only college educated people are the enlightened ones and the smart ones voting for the Democrats for the supposed correct candidate, does that not mean that there is no free speech in colleges, that there is no freedom of expression or thought, and that the only enlightened people are the ones that do follow this type of indoctrination from the college system? which shows that there's no free speech in America, and especially no free thought, and that those that are not voting for Trump are not part of this indoctrination, do not have a right to think, and are not thinking correctly, thus why Trump won the popular vote.
So you seem angry, and I just want to suggest, and I just want to suggest that it might be good to sit with that discomfort for a moment. Sometimes that's what ideological diversity does, is it makes us uncomfortable. So let's sit with it for a moment. I'm being very sincere about this. You are being presented with, I guess, an uncomfortable idea, and you're rejecting it, and that is perfectly within your rights. Now, what I would also suggest, though, is that you're also hearing it incorrectly, because that's not what I said. What I said was, if there's an explanation for why a certain partisan agenda wants to attack higher education, here's one reason why. That is starting from a background principle that I think education is good. It doesn't matter to me, ultimately, what we are all going to decide what that education should result in. I have no power to do any of that. I'm not in the government. I'm not running for political office. I'm not a billionaire donor. I don't have the power. All I can do is make a suggestion to you, and you can say, I think that's stupid. That's fine. What I'm suggesting, though, is be a little nervous about the people who are attacking higher education all the time. Why are they attacking it? Why is that the target? Is it because they're worried about indoctrination, or is it because they're worried about losing their power? And I'm suggesting that the people who really want to maintain their own power for illegitimate purposes, who believe in entitlement as opposed to earning things, those people hate education. That's what I'm suggesting. That's all I'm suggesting. And that is what explains the attack on education that we see every few years come up under the guise of whatever it is, political correctness or cancel culture or whatever we're going to call it. People in power don't like having an educated population. That concerns me, and I think we should all be concerned about that.
I just think we have to avoid the generalizations, Marianne. I'm sure there are people who are hostile to education who have all kinds of illegitimate motives from our perspective, but there are many of us who love education, who have devoted our whole lives to it, and who really want our universities that we love, despite their flaws, to live up to their promises, to live up to their mission. I'm very active in Heterodox Academy, which says so strongly, we love universities. We want to help them be the best that they can be. Every criticism that we make is in the spirit of a constructive criticism, of respect, not of attacking, but of partnering with universities so that Yale will be providing light and truth. And I think it's really important to recognize that it's not just enemies of education who are making these criticisms. I personally think, in the spirit of John Stuart Mill here, that the most loving and respectful thing you can do to an idea or an institution or a person you value is to give them honest, constructive criticism to help improve them. And I take all of your constructive criticisms of free speech orthodoxy in that vein, Marianne.
Well, thank you, Nadine. I am trying to do exactly as you are suggesting and provide a little of that for this.
We have time for about 1 to 2 more questions.
Hi, yeah. I wonder if you'd considered that instead of people attacking higher education by criticizing illiberalism on campus, that it was actually out of a fear that we would stop seeing what Nadine has described, which is the courts upholding the First Amendment. I don't know the exact numbers, but the vast majority, I think, of judges in the high level in this country went to elite universities. I think a majority of the members of the current Supreme Court actually went to Yale. And because of that, what they're taught at Yale, the sort of environment they grow up in, the sort of professors, dare I say, that they might have, is of great interest to people who don't want to see the Supreme Court move away from the decisions that Nadine has mentioned. Do you see people worrying about the institutions that feed the Supreme Court and therefore uphold their constitutional rights as an attack on education, or rather as the opposite, which is a cherishing of education and of liberalism itself.
So when federal judges, in the wake of, I mean, it happened, I think, after Kyle Duncan was heckled or what have you at Stanford, but it then doubled down after some of the anti-war demonstrations. Federal judges who came out and said, we are going to impose a hiring boycott, not even on the students who protested, but on anybody who comes out of those institutions who start in a year after. So not even the people who engage. Those judges said we're going to not let those students become federal, they will not get federal clerkships. That's alarming. We should be really worried about that. Is that a critique of education, or is that judges with real power saying, we don't like what those students were saying, we don't like how that institution handled that, and so we're going to punish, literally punish on the basis of ideological viewpoint? That should concern us very much. What kinds of levers were those federal judges with real power trying to exert against Columbia, against Yale, right? The boycott on Yale because they don't like some things that happened here. Those things. I'm not suggesting that we can't be concerned about a whole bunch of things all at once. We can. What I'm suggesting is there is a priority here, and the priority, I think, should be on those individuals, those institutions that have so much power. The judges right now, the Supreme Court right now, you say we're worried about them moving away from principles of the First Amendment. I think a lot of people reasonably are saying, what do you mean moving away from the rule of law, or moving away from the... They've already become a lawless court in the minds of many people. Well, you know, sorry, not these people, obviously, but in some people. Dobbs, Bruin, 303 Creative, Counterman versus Colorado. I could go on. My point being, there are plenty of people who think the Supreme Court has become a lawless court already, and the idea that we are just now getting concerned about whether or not they might have received an education that might mean something, I don't know why now is the problem. We should have always been concerned about the things that are happening today. Handing presidents, immense power, for instance. We should be concerned about that today. Gerrymandering districts, we should be concerned about that today. So I don't buy the idea that we're concerned about it now because we've suddenly developed some sort of solicitude about this. We should have always been concerned, and there are plenty of Supreme Court and other federal judges acting in certain ways today that should alarm anyone who actually cares about freedom of expression or equality.
Well, I think, again, I resist generalizations. I mean, I think that on the whole, the Supreme Court's First Amendment jurisprudence, since that's the immediate topic here, has vastly improved throughout the course of history. The tragic examples you gave from the past, Marianne, were before the Supreme Court started to actually enforce the First Amendment. Does it still make mistakes from my perspective? Very much so, but it has come closer and closer to saying that we are not going to deprive people of freedom of speech solely because of who they are, people who had been excluded in earlier parts of our history, or solely because their ideas are unpopular or offensive. And I think that principle is what has allowed you to advocate, me to advocate, anybody to get engaged in the political process, to really have an opportunity to become a meaningful participant in our democratic society. And we may not like the way our fellow citizens vote, but that is what democracy is. And free speech, along with democracy,
I don't like the way people vote, but that is not so much the
that we
question
have,
as if we are keeping a democracy. Yes, I would agree with you. I submit to you now, we have decided that we are not going to keep it.
Thank you very much. And thank, please, our guests again for this enlivening conversation.